Yes. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Friday Night Jazz Vespers here at Trinity-Grace. We're pleased you're able to be here tonight, whether you're here in person or perhaps joining us online. Welcome to you. We want to first begin by acknowledging that Trinity-Grace and our in-person gathering tonight is taking place on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And we give thanks to those peoples for their stewardship of the land, caretaking of the land through many, many generations, for the wisdom that they carry, and commit ourselves to the important work of truth and reconciliation. I'm Reverend Sandra Nixon. If I haven't met you before, I'm the coordinating minister here at Trinity-Grace, and I am delighted to be able to just welcome you tonight and ask you to help me offer a warm welcome to the Dan Reynolds trio who are here tonight from Canada. I believe each of the band members will get a more proper introduction in a few minutes. And they are going to be playing the sacred jazz suite, the Sower, based, of course, on the biblical parable of the sower and the seed. Also, our composer is in the house too, Dan Reynolds. A couple of quick notes before we begin, just to help you us all enjoy our time here together. There's a washroom at the back of the church there on the right, and 2 more down the stairs if you need them. A quick reminder to put your devices on mute or airplane mode. Thank you for your donations this evening. They do go to help support the musicians and help us continue to offer this type of service in the evening, these Jazz Vespers. I also want to welcome Reverend Dr. Brian Fraser, the minister of Brentwood Presbyterian in Burnaby, whose church commissioned these sacred jazz suites that we are featuring in our Vespers services over the fall. And Brian will be offering the narrative reflections this evening, and I'm going to turn things over to him in just a moment. First, just like to invite you to bring yourself fully here this evening. Just take a moment, take a breath, let go of whatever has been today and whatever it took for you to get here. The light of the world, the love at the heart of the universe has been with us through the day. Perhaps you could feel it in the radiant sunshine outside. And now we turn to the light as it settles in us. Through the sacred energy of music and reflection and being in community together. Ryan.
Thank you. Thank you, Sandra. It's always a privilege to be here at Trinity-Grace and be working in this space with you and with all of the rest of the wonderful people here in the congregation and community. Let me introduce the trio. Simon Millard on trumpet, Luciana Rigabello on guitar, and Dan Reynolds on piano. You can applaud. Thank you very much for joining us for this performance and the pondering that goes along with it of the sacred jazz suite, the Sower. It was composed, as Sandra said, by Dan Reynolds. Dan is our director of music in your Brentwood Presbyterian Church. Has been now for 10 years now. Ooh, time flies when you're having fun. And he's joined this evening by Simon Millard on trumpet, and as I said, Luciano Rigabello on guitar. And we want to thank very much our host this evening, Trinity-Grace United Church. As Sandra said, my name is Brian Fraser. I am the minister over at Brentwood, and I coordinate the Sacred Jazz Suite project. One of the things that we've invited various jazz musicians to do is compose jazz suites around the parables. Now, parables are puzzling, and they're meant to be. Read a parable of Jesus in a small group and ask them what it means. You'll get as many answers, most different, as there are people in the group. And probably one or two of those people will have 3 or 4 different interpretations of the meaning. But that's the whole point, as I understand it. As I understand Jesus' intent in telling those stories. He wanted us to consider our contributions to life from a different perspective, in a different way, in a process of learning that makes a difference in the ways that we show up in the world. Now, seldom in the parables does Jesus explain the meanings he sees in the stories he tells. He lets the stories generate the meanings within those who hear them. The parable of the sower is an exception, at least in the way it's recorded in the Gospels. And the communities that pulled together the accounts of Jesus' life and teaching a few decades after the events had happened included an explanation for this parable. We'll touch on that later. But for now, let's focus on the story itself. The recounting of Jesus' telling of this parable is in all 3 of the Synoptic Gospels. Matthew 13, 1-23, Mark 4, 1-20, and in Luke 8, 4-15. It also showed up in the Gospel of Thomas. And the Gospel of Thomas was one of those many accounts of the life and teachings of Jesus that didn't make the final cut to the Bible as we know it. We have no idea how many of these Gospels were around. We know of, 25 to 30 that have been named. We don't have, most of them, we don't have any copies of them. But in the 390s, under the influence of Augustine of Hippo, as the church became imperialized, the 4 Gospels were finally chosen. What I want to do is read the parable from Mark's version this evening. Again, he began to teach beside the sea. Such a very large crowd gathered around him that he got into a boat on the sea and sat there, while the whole crowd was beside the sea on the land. And he began to teach them many things in parables. And in his teaching, he said to them, "Listen, a sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seed fell on a path, and the birds came and ate it up. Other seed fell on rocky ground, where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly. And quickly, since it had no depth of soil. When the sun rose, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it withered away. Other seed fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it, and it yielded no grain. Other seed fell on good soil and brought forth grain, growing up and increasing and yielding 30 and 60 and 100-fold. And he said, if you have ears to hear, then hear." So, what the Spirit of the Creator's Christ, Jesus of Nazareth, is provoking among us and through us this evening is a new mode of hearing that parable, in the mode of jazz and reflection. For those of you hearing and considering the recording later, on the recording we're making here, on the Trinity-Grace YouTube channel, we invite you into the same process, wherever you are and however you may be engaging with this. Now, my suggestions about hearing this parable emerge from over 60 years of practice in church leadership. And in the past decade, wonderful, playful conversations with Dan as we've collaborated in provoking missioning at Brentwood, missioning that is more faithful, wise, and effective in a rapidly changing social climate that features soils that are resistant to the transforming consciousness of the gospel. And especially the dimension of the gospel that has to do with the Creator's forgiving and reconciling love at work in our midst. So we pray that the seeds of a new consciousness will be sown among us this evening. Surprising insights will transform our faithfulness, wisdom, and effectiveness in partnering with our Creator in cultivating the well-being of our world. The first movement is the nature of seeds. first movement focuses on the seeds of a transforming consciousness, seeds that are sown as we converse with each other about what matters most to us. Those seeds carry within them an awareness and a recognition of the divine presence working through and in our lives, for the benefit of that presence, of others, and of ourselves, all interconnected and interdependent. Dan and Simon and a couple of other friends who've been playing with them for a long time introduced me to a guy by the name of David Hawkins. Helped me engage more fully to Hawkins' work that points to a devotional non-duality. That's how he describes it. A dynamic in our consciousness by which we are brought to a recognition that everything is integrated and interdependent. And we are being invited into a more conscious way of showing up in and for the world that generates justice and peace with kindness and humility. This is the liberated and liberating consciousness that is so central to jazz as an art form. To the respect for the contributions of everyone who is playing, including the audience. But all of those contributions flow into manifestations of the Creator's forgiving and reconciling love for the whole world. That's the essential message of the Christian gospel. A message that is so dramatically distorted in so many tragic ways in our times and indeed over the centuries. So to free this consciousness, much has to be unlearned. And we pray that your experience tonight of this sacred jazz suite will provoke the kind of unlearning and relearning that Jesus was trying to accomplish and did accomplish over the generations through many of his parables. It's interesting in the records of the telling of this parable that the crowds are listening in. And that Jesus is telling many parables. We don't know what the other ones were that were told at that time, when he was out in the boat with all of them gathered around the shore. But they, along with we, are being invited to unlearn old forms of consciousness, old ways of understanding things, and mature into new ways that align more fully with the essence of human flourishing in this world. An essence that was summarized by Jesus when he said, the summary of all the law and the prophets is this: love God, love others, and love yourself. Living into that summary of right relationships is where our consciousness of true freedom gets deepened. So let's listen for that in the next movements as we consider more deeply the soils and the context, the conditions of the sowing of these seeds of a deeper consciousness of our Creator's intent for our flourishing. The second movement focuses on the seeds by the roadside. The sower scatters the seeds broadly. No restrictions, no boundaries. Just they fall on all kinds of soil. The focus of the parable and Dan's interpretation of it in this suite is that variety of soils and the conditions upon which the seeds fall. And it should be noted that these are the same kinds of seeds. Right? There's not different seeds for different soils. These are the seeds of a new consciousness. A new consciousness that will see things differently, that will notice more clearly the conditions where they've been scattered, and that will find ways of surviving and thriving in spite of the barriers posed by the soils on which they've fallen. Now, in an effort to ensure maximum coverage, the sower cast his seeds widely with abandon. Some of the seeds fell on the roadside. Maybe it's one of those old Roman roads where the stones had no soil available at all. Maybe it's a dirt road where the earth has been compacted to the point where it's as impervious to the seeds as the paving stones. Whatever the reason for the hardness of the surface, the seeds are exposed to creatures that want to take it off, to take them off for their own benefit. And special mention is made in the parable of the birds who come and remove the seeds before they can take root and gain strength as a flourishing plant. The seeds simply seem to disappear. But I found myself wondering about what happens after the birds have ingested the seeds. I was wondering both in the sense of thinking about it, but also being playfully surprised by some of the ideas that emerge from my consideration. Birds eat the seeds, and they often go through the digestive process unchanged. The husks remain intact, and they are eliminated in a different location. Perhaps a location where the soil is more suitable for the seeds germinating and producing fruits. The point here is the resilience of the seeds. They survive in a broad range of soils and conditions. And so, can you imagine the kind of resilience found in the seeds of a transformed and transforming consciousness of our Creator's forgiving and reconciling love to the whole world? These seeds find their resilience in the life force contained in the ways they are designed and intended to work. Whatever the conditions in which they fall, that vitality remains in the soul of the seed, to be activated in the Creator's time and the Creator's place. Trusting in that resilience is an invitation that I heard in this movement. Let's move on to the third movement. This is the seeds on the rocky road. So the next set of conditions that we just heard interpreted in jazz is the rocky ground. There's some fertile soil available, but not enough to sustain long-lasting growth. The seeds clearly germinate here, but there's not enough soil to nourish their growth. The nutrients that best serve flourishing are not available in sufficient quantities to sustain productive growth. And so these seeds were scorched by the sun, an element in the ecosystem of Galilee that was harsh in its destructiveness. Life was burned away just as it was getting going, without the nourishment needed for lasting faithfulness, fruitfulness. It's not a pretty picture. So as I played around with my imaginings of these dire conditions, I found myself drawn to possibilities that aren't explored in the parable. And that's the beauty of good stories, isn't it? They invite us to dig deeper into the potential of forces of life overcoming the power of death. And I wondered whether the fragile plants that did grow provided some food for those birds that we heard about in the last movement, to animals that lived in the immediate vicinity, especially insects and smaller life forms that filled the soil. There's a robust ecosystem of life forces in the soil. It's constantly at work, no matter what the appearances are on the surface. Hard and dry, scorched by the sun, but underneath that, there's a whole ecosystem of life going on. There's an opening paragraph in an article written by John Vidal back in 2012 in The Guardian that talks about this in a way that delighted me. Long live the creepy crawlers, the bugs, the tiny wigglers and wrigglers, the minuscule parasites and nematodes, the mites and oribatids, oribatids, anyhow, those things, and all the myriad forms of life that buzz, crawl, and throb below our feet. Most have been barely given a second thought by science, but biologists now think that these mostly named creatures make up the beating heart of the biosphere. Many of them aren't even named, and that the fate of all our life may depend on the well-being of their fragile worlds. Now, I don't imagine this kind of thinking happened among the crowd with whom Jesus was storytelling, but this dynamic was at work beneath their feet and in the water under the boat from which Jesus was speaking. Another wonderful verbal expression of this kind of integrated consciousness, a consciousness of our sanctifying significance in the symbiosis of all of our creation, comes from the David Suzuki Foundation in its Declaration of Interdependence. And I hang around the edges of the Suzuki elders, so this has become really kind of seminal for me. The Declaration was drafted, I think, by the Foundation in 1992, year of the UN Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. Luciano's from Brazil. And it reads in part, humans have become so numerous and our tools so powerful that we have driven fellow creatures to extinction, dammed the great rivers, torn down ancient forests, poisoned the earth, rain and wind, and ripped holes in the sky. Our science has brought pain as well as joy. Our comfort is paid for by the suffering of millions. We are learning from our mistakes. We are mourning our vanished kin. And we now build a new politics of hope. We respect and uphold the absolute need for clean air, water, and soil. We see that economic activities that benefit the few while shrinking the inheritance of the many are wrong. And since environmental degradation erodes biological capital forever, Full ecological and social cost must enter all equations of development. We are one brief generation in the long march of time. The future is not ours to erase. So again, this kind of scientific ecological analysis probably wasn't in the minds of the listeners that day by the lake when they heard Jesus' story. But it is something that the Spirit might provoke in our imaginations, in our place, and in our time. Seeds both need favorable conditions to flourish and are more resilient in preserving life than we often think. These are inspirations and insights that we can play with as we consider how our Creator's life-giving energy sustains and expands our flourishing for partnering in replenishing the well-being of our creation. Seeds of a transformed consciousness are seminal in generating this flourishing future. But there are more barriers to consider. Let's listen to the fourth movement about the seeds among the thistles. barriers to the growth of our transforming consciousness, our recognition of the enlightenment that comes from awakening to our loving companionship with the Spirit of the Creator's Christ, Jesus of Nazareth, those often feel like entangling thickets of thistles and thorns. They are active powers in our lives that seek to distract and disorient us. They invite us to pay attention to dynamics in our lives that divide and destroy. They seek to keep us bound up in fear. They seek to strangle creative life out of us by insisting on conformity and compliance with systems of living together that privilege the few and oppress the many. Read the stories of Jesus carefully and openly, and you'll find that they all convey a different consciousness of what it means to be human. What it means to be human in the caring company of the Creator's forgiving and reconciling love. That's why he tells them, invite people to change the ways they show up, to transform the ways they inspire and influence people in their network. What are the distractions and orientations keeping you in bondage, constricting the contributions you were created to offer, keeping you entangled in fears and angers that diminish your agency in your lives? And what can we do in loving collaboration with others to reduce the power of those thistles, to stunt your growth and prevent you from flourishing? Opening yourself to the nourishing swing of this music, finding in it inspiration and instruction to be transformed into a flourishing field of rich, ripe grain, alive with the potential to feed the multitudes, is a good step forward. Think of it as finding the breath to have a better conversation. A conversation in which you invite others to explore possibilities of living together differently, replenishing the soils that can sustain and enhance flourishing growth. And that takes us to the fifth movement, good soil and much fruit. So much of the seed in a story falls on good ground that's been prepared and tended to be receptive to the seeds and provide them with the resources to grow well, to flourish in the producing of much fruit and the delight that we heard at the end of that movement. These are the days before our current practices of chemical farming on a massive scale to produce millions of tons of wheat to ship around the world began. Estimates of the increased use of chemical fertilizers suggest that we went from almost none being used in the early 1900s to over 250 million tons being used by the early 2000s. And what we are discovering a century after these practices were developed is that they have depleted our soils. They've exhausted them with chemicals that produced short-term gains and made them dependent on man-made nutrients in ways that actually threaten the well-being of our natural environment. But back to the good ground of the parable. This is soil where optimum growth happens for our seeds. Grain is produced that nourishes people to flourish. In Jesus' day, the ancient Jewish tradition of leaving grain on the edges of the field for the poor and the disadvantaged to harvest was probably still being followed. Though even then, under Roman rule, small farms were being repossessed and consolidated for the production of grain for the rapidly growing cities of that era. And those landlords might well have insisted that every last grain be harvested for profit. But what of the seeds of transforming consciousness that we've been exploring this evening, as we've been inspired and instructed by this wonderful musicking? Little church where Dan and I collaborated musicking and missioning Brentwood Presbyterian Church over in Burnaby, British Columbia, sings near the end of our services every Sunday morning a song composed by Dan and me with the words taken from Paul's summary of the fruits of the Spirit in Galatians, scattered like seeds throughout that part of the Roman Empire. And those fruits are the nutrients in the rich soil of the Creator's forgiving and reconciling love, manifest in human flesh most fully in Jesus of Nazareth. They are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-composure. Most of the English translations use self-mastery or self-control for that last fruit of the Spirit, but the Greek also has that wonderful connotation of self-composure, of the ways in which we show up as calm and compassionate, nourishing relationships, nourishing blessings in all of our networks. That's what church gatherings at their best offer, that kind of nourishment. Let me say thanks again to Trinity-Grace United for their hospitality, to Dan, to Simon, Luciano for the wonderful musicking this evening, for their artistry, to all of you for participating here in person, those of you, where's the camera? Those of you online, thanks for being with us. Those of you watching later in that particular mode of participating, we're delighted to have you here in that way as well. Know that as we finish this conversation with the final movement of Dan's suite, that many more conversations will follow. And that every one of those conversations we have the opportunity to sow the seeds of mercy and grace, to sow them without any restraint in every field and in every condition of soil that you can imagine. It's the resilience of the seed that's important to remember. The resilience of God's forgiving and reconciling love that cannot be eliminated or extinguished. Back to Dan, Simon, and Luciano to finish us off.
Yeah, I was forgetting to work the camera angles because I was transported in many ways and throughout that. And I feel like I've been on a journey. I feel like I've pictured the different kinds of soil that I've found myself in my life, and ending on such a spirit of hope and grace. What real flourishing of the seeds of my spirit can be possible. Yes, so another thank you, please, for our band and thank you to Brian Fraser. Thank you so much for your reflections and for also taking us on a journey with those as well into an exploration. Two kinds of exploration, intertwining and very, very rich. And I know it's going to keep percolating for me when I go home. Thank you to all of you for making the story come alive. Thank you to Brentwood Presbyterian for commissioning this project, the Sacred Suite project, and for walking with our congregation on our journey and our exploration. And thank you to all of you who have been here this evening. Part of what happens here is the energy that we all bring into the space. And so we appreciate that you were here and part of this experience. Wanted to let you know we have one more Jazz Vespers scheduled, and that is for December the 15th. We will be moving from Sacred Jazz Suites to Christmas. And so it's Christmas Jazz, December the 15th, with quintessential jazz. We're looking forward to having them here. And also, if you like a more participatory musical experience, we also have a community carol sing on December the 3rd, on Sunday evening. With that, I wish you blessings and peace and a safe trip, a safe journey home. Might be a little bit of coffee left. Oh, yes.